The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the dusty Mercantile, and Katherine Ellis stepped down onto the wooden planks of San Francisco's crowded street, her hands burning beneath her gloves despite the cool October air of 1872. She had scrubbed floors and washed linens for 3 years in a Boston boarding house, using harsh lye soap that stripped away not just dirt but also the softness from her skin, leaving her palms cracked and bleeding more often than not. Now, at 23 years old, she had traveled across the entire country to marry a rancher named Charles Anderson, a man she knew only through 6 carefully worded letters and 1 slightly faded photograph. The city sprawled before her, much larger than she had imagined, with buildings climbing the hills like determined climbers ascending a mountain. The smell of salt water mixed with horse manure and chimney smoke, and everywhere she looked, people rushed past with purpose. Katherine clutched her single carpetbag closer, feeling the weight of her decision settle in her stomach like a stone. She had answered Charles's advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper out of desperation more than hope, but his letters had been kind, describing his cattle ranch in the valley south of the city and his simple life that needed a woman's touch. A tall man stood near a hitching post, his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. He wore worn denim pants tucked into scuffed leather boots and a dusty brown vest over a faded blue shirt. When he saw her scanning the street, he straightened and removed his hat, revealing sandy hair and eyes the color of creek water in summer. Katherine recognized the strong jaw from the photograph, though the picture had not captured the way the corners of his mouth turned down slightly, giving him a perpetually serious expression. "Miss Ellis." His voice was deeper than she expected, rough from years of calling across open pastures. "Yes, Mr. Anderson," he nodded once, his gaze moving from her face to her bag and back again. "Just Charles is fine. Welcome to San Francisco. I hope the journey was not too difficult." "It was long," Katherine admitted, pulling off one glove to shake his outstretched hand. The moment their palms met, she saw him wince, and she quickly pulled away, mortified. Her hands were rough as tree bark, the skin thick and calloused, with angry red cracks along her knuckles that had never quite healed properly. In Boston, she had stopped caring about their appearance, but now, meeting her future husband for the first time, shame flooded through her. Charles looked at her hand, then at her face, his expression unreadable. "Those look painful." "They are fine," she lied, pulling the glove back on quickly. "Just from work. It is nothing." He did not argue, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been concern. He picked up her bag as though it weighed nothing and gestured toward a wagon hitched nearby. "The ranch is about 2 hours south. We should get moving before it gets too dark." "There is an inn at the halfway point if you would prefer to rest first, though." Katherine shook her head. "I would rather see my new home if that is acceptable." "It is." Charles helped her onto the wagon seat, his hands careful and steady, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. The horse, a sturdy bay mare with a white blaze, started forward at his command, and they left the bustling streets of San Francisco behind, heading south through rolling hills covered in golden grass. For the first hour, they barely spoke. Katherine watched the landscape change, the city giving way to farms and ranches, the air growing cleaner and sweeter. Charles kept his attention on the road, occasionally glancing at her as though checking to make sure she had not vanished like a mirage. Finally, as they crested a hill and saw the Pacific Ocean stretching blue and endless to the west, he cleared his throat. "I know this is not what most women would choose," he said slowly. "Coming all this way to marry a stranger. I want you to know that I will do my best to be a good husband. I cannot promise luxury or excitement, but I can promise honesty and hard work." Katherine turned to look at him properly for the first time. His profile was strong, his nose slightly crooked as though it had been broken once, and there were lines around his eyes from squinting against the sun. He was probably close to her age, maybe a year or two older, and there was something solid about him, something steady that made her feel less adrift than she had in months. "I am not looking for luxury or excitement," she replied. "I am looking for a home, a place where I belong." "Can you offer that? I can try." He met her eyes briefly, and she saw sincerity there, plain and undisguised. "The ranch is not much, but it is mine. Well, ours, if you will have it. 300 acres, about 100 head of cattle, a house that needs some fixing up. I have 2 hired hands who help with the herding and branding. They are good men, respectful." "What happened to your previous wife?" Katherine asked, then immediately regretted the bluntness of the question. Charles did not seem offended. "I have never been married before. I was engaged once, 7 years ago, but she changed her mind a month before the wedding. Decided she wanted to move to Sacramento with her family instead of staying on a ranch. I do not blame her. This life is not easy." "Neither was washing floors and chamber pots for demanding boarders," Katherine said quietly. "At least here, I will be working for myself, for us." Something in his expression softened. "I read in your letters that you had been working in Boston since you were 16. That is a long time to be in service to others. My parents died of fever when I was 15. I had no other family, no inheritance. The boarding house owner took me in, but I earned my keep." Katherine flexed her fingers unconsciously, feeling the tightness of the damaged skin beneath the gloves. "I am not afraid of hard work, Charles. I am afraid of spending the rest of my life alone, with nothing to call my own. Then we understand each other." He guided the wagon down a winding path that led through a grove of oak trees. "The ranch is just beyond this valley." When they emerged from the trees, Katherine saw a simple wooden house with a covered porch, a large barn painted red but fading, and several smaller outbuildings scattered across a flat area of land. Beyond the buildings, fenced pastures stretched toward distant hills, and she could see cattle dotting the landscape like brown and white stones. It was not grand, but it was clean and well-maintained, and there was something appealing about the way it sat in the valley, protected from the worst winds by the surrounding hills. "It is lovely," she said, and meant it. Charles looked surprised. "Most city women find it too isolated." "I am not most city women." Katherine smiled for the first time since arriving, and she saw something in Charles's face shift, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He drove the wagon up to the house and helped her down, then carried her bag inside. The interior was sparse but functional, with a main room that served as both kitchen and sitting area, 2 bedrooms, and a small washroom that had been added onto the back. The furniture was handmade but sturdy, and everything was surprisingly clean for a bachelor's home. "I did my best to tidy up," Charles admitted, setting her bag down near one of the bedroom doors. "That room is yours. I will sleep in the other. I thought, given the circumstances, we might want to take things slowly. Get to know each other before we make anything official." Katherine felt a rush of gratitude mixed with nervousness. She had been prepared to marry him immediately, to consummate the union that night whether she felt ready or not, because that was what mail-order brides did. The fact that he was offering her time, offering her a choice, made her see him in a new light. "That is very considerate," she managed to say. "I will let you settle in," Charles said, backing toward the door. "There is a pump for water in the kitchen, and I stocked the pantry with basics. If you are hungry, help yourself to anything. I need to check on the herd before dark, but I will be back in a few hours. Will you be all right here alone?" "I will be fine." Katherine watched him leave, then stood in the quiet house, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the lowing of distant cattle, the creak of the barn door swinging in the breeze, the call of a hawk overhead. Slowly, she removed her gloves and looked down at her hands. In the fading afternoon light coming through the window, they looked even worse than usual, the skin white and tight where it had healed poorly, red and angry where it had cracked open again during the journey. She unpacked her meager belongings, hanging her 2 dresses in the simple wardrobe and placing her undergarments in the drawer of a small dresser. Her personal items, a hairbrush, a small mirror, a book of poetry that had been her mother's, she arranged on the dresser top. The room felt more like hers with those small touches, and she sat on the bed, testing its firmness, finding it comfortable enough. When Charles returned as the sun was setting, she had managed to prepare a simple meal of beans and bacon using the supplies he had mentioned, along with biscuits made from flour and lard. It was not fancy, but it was hot and filling, and Charles ate with obvious appreciation, complimenting her cooking between bites. "This is better than anything I have managed in months," he said, mopping up the last of the beans with a piece of biscuit. "I am not much of a cook. Mostly I survive on jerky and whatever is simplest." "Then I am already earning my place," Katherine said lightly, though she winced as she reached for the coffee pot, her cracked knuckles splitting open slightly from the movement. Charles noticed immediately. He stood up from the table and went to a cabinet, rummaging for a moment before returning with a small tin. "May I see your hands?" Katherine hesitated, then slowly extended them across the table. Charles opened the tin, revealing a pale yellow salve that smelled of beeswax and herbs. Without asking permission, he took one of her hands gently in his own and began applying the salve with careful, methodical movements, working it into the damaged skin with his thumbs. His touch was surprisingly gentle for a man who worked with cattle and rope all day, and Katherine found herself holding her breath, not from pain, but from the unexpected intimacy of the gesture. No one had touched her hands with kindness in years. The matron at the boarding house had scolded her for complaining about the pain, telling her that weak hands meant a weak character, and the other servants had been too caught up in their own struggles to notice hers. "What is in this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Beeswax, lanolin from sheep's wool, comfrey, and calendula. An old rancher taught me how to make it when I first started working cattle. It is good for rope burns, cuts, anything that damages the skin." Charles moved to her other hand, his focus complete. "These are from lye soap." "Yes. For 3 years, I scrubbed floors and washed linens every day. The soap they used was strong enough to strip paint." Katherine watched his face as he worked, noting the concentration in his expression, the small crease between his eyebrows. "I tried wearing gloves, but they would get wet and make it worse. This should help. It will not fix years of damage overnight, but if we apply it every evening, your skin should start to heal properly." Charles finished with her second hand and looked up, meeting her eyes. "I know that my ranch is not a palace, Katherine, but you will never have to scrub floors with lye soap again. That is a promise." Something in her chest tightened, not unpleasantly. "Why are you being so kind to me? You do not even know me." "Because you came all this way on faith, trusting that I would keep my word. The least I can do is honor that trust." Charles closed the tin and set it on the table between them. "And because no one should have to live with that kind of pain when there is something that can help." That night, Katherine lay in her new bed, her hands tingling slightly from the salve, and thought about the man sleeping in the room across the hall. She had expected many things when she agreed to become a mail-order bride: indifference, awkwardness, perhaps even cruelty, but she had not expected genuine kindness. Charles Anderson was a puzzle, quiet and reserved, but with depths she was only beginning to glimpse. The next morning, she woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the distant lowing of cattle. She dressed quickly and found Charles already in the kitchen, attempting to make coffee over the wood stove. He looked relieved when he saw her. "I was trying not to wake you," he said, "but I am afraid I am not very quiet in the mornings." "I do not mind. I am used to waking early." Katherine took over the coffee preparation, and soon had a pot brewing along with a breakfast of eggs from the henhouse and more biscuits. They ate together as the sun rose over the hills, painting the valley in shades of gold and orange. After breakfast, Charles showed her around the ranch properly. He introduced her to his two hired hands, a grizzled older man named Thomas who had worked cattle most of his life, and a younger man of about 20 named James who was still learning the trade. Both men were polite and respectful, tipping their hats and welcoming her to the ranch with genuine warmth. Charles walked her through the barn, showing her the milking cow, the chickens, the workhorses, and the various tools and equipment needed to run the operation. He explained the rhythm of ranch life, the early mornings and long days, the seasonal work of branding and roundups, the constant maintenance required to keep everything running smoothly. "If this is going to be your home," he said as they stood in the barn doorway looking out over the pastures, "then you should understand what we do here and why. I do not expect you to herd cattle or mend fences, but I want you to feel part of this, not just a housekeeper I imported from Boston." "I would like to learn," Katherine said. "I have spent years being told what to do and when to do it. I would like to understand the purpose behind the work for once." Charles nodded approvingly. "Then I will teach you whatever you want to know." Over the following weeks, they fell into a routine. Katherine took over the household duties, cooking and cleaning and managing the vegetable garden that had been neglected for the past year. She baked bread and churned butter, preserved vegetables for the winter, and mended clothes that had gone too long without proper attention. But she also spent time learning about the ranch, watching Charles work with the horses, helping Thomas feed the chickens, and listening to James tell stories about the wild country farther south. Every evening, after supper and the washing up, Charles would bring out the tin of salve and tend to Katherine's hands with the same careful attention he had shown that first night. It became a ritual between them, a quiet time when they would talk about their days, sharing observations and small confidences while his strong fingers worked the healing ointment into her damaged skin. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Katherine's hands began to improve. The angry redness faded first, then the deepest cracks started to close. The skin was still rough and scarred, but the constant pain that had been her companion for 3 years began to ease, and she found herself able to do delicate tasks like needlework without wincing. "It is working," she said one evening, about a month after her arrival, holding her hands up to the lamplight and examining them with wonder. "I cannot believe how much better they feel. I am glad." Charles set the tin aside and held onto her hands for a moment longer than necessary, his thumbs resting against her wrists. "You have good hands, Katherine, strong hands. They deserve to be treated well." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw that his expression had changed from the polite courtesy of the early days. There was warmth in his eyes now, and something else, something that made her heart beat faster. They had been living together for over a month, sleeping in separate rooms, treating each other with careful respect. But underneath that propriety, something had been growing, fed by shared meals and evening conversations and the simple intimacy of daily life together. "Charles," she began, not sure what she wanted to say, but he squeezed her hands gently and released them, standing up from the table. "It is getting late. We should both get some rest." But he paused at the doorway to his room and looked back at her. Katherine, I want you to know that I am glad you came. I know this arrangement was not ideal, but I am grateful that it was you who answered my advertisement. I am glad too, she said softly, and meant it with all her heart. The weeks turned into months and autumn gave way to winter. The California winter was nothing like the bitter cold of Boston, but it brought rain that turned the roads to mud and made outdoor work more challenging. Katherine and Charles spent more time indoors, and the forced proximity only deepened their growing connection. They talked about everything during those long winter evenings, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Charles told her about his parents, who had died when he was 19, leaving him the ranch and the responsibility of making it succeed. Katherine shared memories of her mother teaching her to read and her father's workshop, where he had crafted furniture before the fever took them both. They discovered shared tastes in literature and a mutual love of music, though neither of them could play an instrument. One rainy afternoon in December, Katherine was in the kitchen when she heard a commotion outside. She looked through the window and saw Charles running toward the barn, followed by Thomas and James. Heart pounding, she grabbed a shawl and hurried out into the rain, her boots squelching in the mud. In the barn, she found them gathered around one of the horses, a young mare who was clearly in distress. Charles had his hands on her neck, speaking to her in a low, soothing voice while Thomas examined her. "What happened?" Katherine asked, staying back so as not to spook the animal. "Colic, I think," Thomas said grimly. "She got into the grain store somehow and ate too much. We need to keep her walking, keep her insides moving, or we will lose her." For the next 6 hours, they took turns walking the mare around and around the barn, occasionally letting her rest, but never letting her lie down fully. Katherine insisted on taking shifts despite Charles's protests, and she found herself bonding with the frightened animal, stroking her neck and murmuring encouragement as they paced the worn path in the straw. It was nearly midnight when the mare finally passed gas and manure, signs that her gut was working again. Thomas pronounced her out of danger, and James went to secure the grain store properly. Charles and Katherine stood together in the barn, both soaked with rain and sweat, exhausted but relieved. "You did not have to help," Charles said, brushing wet hair back from his forehead. "This is not part of what I expected from you." "This is my home now," Katherine replied. "These are my animals too. Of course I helped." Charles looked at her for a long moment, then stepped forward and cupped her face in his hands. "Katherine Ellis, I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I am grateful every single day that you are here." Before she could respond, he kissed her, gentle and questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her arms wrapping around his waist, and kissed him back with all the emotion that had been building between them for months. He tasted like coffee and rain, and his lips were warm despite the cold night air. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Katherine felt as though something fundamental had shifted in her world. "I think," she said carefully, "that it is time we made this marriage official." "If you still want to, that is," Charles laughed, a sound of pure joy that she had never heard from him before. "Want to? Katherine, I have been trying to work up the courage to ask you that for weeks. I did not want to pressure you, but I have been hoping. Then let us not wait any longer." Katherine took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Let us be married properly, before God and witnesses." They rode into San Francisco the following week and were married in a small church by a minister who had married hundreds of couples during the gold rush days. Thomas and James served as witnesses, both grinning throughout the brief ceremony. Katherine wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that Charles said brought out her eyes, and Charles wore a new shirt that she had made for him, with careful stitches and buttons she had purchased with egg money. After the ceremony, They had dinner at a modest restaurant near the waterfront, and Charles bought Katherine a thin gold ring that he slipped onto her finger with shaking hands. It was the happiest day of her life, made sweeter by the knowledge that it was not based on desperation or necessity, but on genuine affection that had grown between them through shared work and quiet evenings, and the simple act of caring for each other's wounds. Their wedding night was tender and slightly awkward, as first times often are, but filled with laughter and patience, and a deep desire to please each other. Charles was gentle with her, mindful of her inexperience, and Katherine found herself grateful once again for his kindness, his willingness to take things slowly until she relaxed into his embrace. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in his bed that was now their bed, Charles took her hands and kissed each palm, each knuckle, each fingertip. "What are you doing?" Katherine asked, smiling in the darkness. "Thanking every part of you for existing," Charles murmured against her skin. "These hands that were hurt for so long, that work so hard now, that touch me with such gentleness. I love them. I love you." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you too. I did not expect to when I came here. I thought this would be a practical arrangement, a way to survive. But you have given me so much more than survival, Charles. You have given me a home, a purpose, and a love I never dreamed I would find." "We have given that to each other," Charles corrected, pulling her close. "You saved me too, Katherine. I did not realize how lonely I was until you arrived and filled all the empty spaces I had stopped noticing." Winter gave way to spring, and the ranch came alive with new growth. Katherine planted a larger vegetable garden, adding flowers along the borders because she wanted beauty as well as function. She also started keeping better records of the ranch operations, her neat handwriting filling ledgers with accounts of cattle births, feed purchases, and sale prices. Charles was impressed by her organizational skills and gladly turned over the financial management to her, admitting that he had always struggled with the paperwork side of ranching. In April, they discovered that Katherine was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when the doctor in San Francisco confirmed it, she felt a mix of excitement and terror. Charles, however, was purely delighted, sweeping her into his arms despite her protests that people were watching. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as though he could not quite believe it. "A son or daughter, our child." Katherine found herself caught up in his enthusiasm, and together they began preparing for the new arrival. Charles built a cradle from oak wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk, and Katherine sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her once rough hands now nimble enough for delicate work. The salve tin had a permanent place on their bedside table, and Charles still rubbed the ointment into her skin every evening, a ritual they had continued even after her hands had healed, simply because it was their special time together. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through spring and into summer. Katherine felt well most of the time, though the heat of July made her uncomfortable and swollen. Charles was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly trying to keep her from doing any heavy work, until she finally sat him down and explained that she was pregnant, not ill, and that she needed to stay active. "I just worry," he admitted, taking her hand across the dinner table. "You are the most important thing in my world, Katherine. You and this baby. If anything happened to you—" "Nothing will happen to me," Katherine assured him, though she knew that childbirth was always a risk. "I am strong, Charles. You know that. And I have you, and we have the doctor's information. Everything will be fine." In late August, on a hot afternoon when the air shimmered with heat over the golden hills, Katherine's labor began. Charles sent James riding hard for the doctor, while he and Thomas helped Katherine into the bedroom and tried to keep her comfortable. The doctor arrived 3 hours later, a capable woman named Dr. Margaret Shaw, who had delivered hundreds of babies in San Francisco and the surrounding areas. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. Charles stayed with Katherine the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, and whispering encouragement even when she cursed him for getting her into this condition. Dr. Shaw remained calm and confident, guiding Katherine through each contraction, each push, until finally, as the sun rose over the valley, a baby's cry filled the room. "A boy," Dr. Shaw announced, holding up the squalling, red-faced infant. "A healthy, strong boy." Charles looked at his son with tears streaming down his face, and Katherine, exhausted but triumphant, held out her arms to receive the baby. He was perfect, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn the same creek water color as his father's. They named him Samuel Thomas Anderson, after Charles's father and the ranch hand who had become like family to them. The months after Samuel's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings, but they were also filled with joy. Katherine had never known she could love someone so fiercely, so completely, as she loved her son. And watching Charles with Samuel, seeing the big rancher transformed into a gentle, doting father who would rock the baby for hours and sing off-key lullabies, made her fall in love with her husband all over again. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Charles's careful management and Katherine's financial acumen combined to increase their herd and improve their property. They hired another hand to help with the expanding operation, and Thomas, now in his 60s, began training James to take over as foreman. Katherine's hands, which had once been her shame, became a source of pride. The scars were still visible, reminders of her past, but the skin was healthy and strong now, capable of kneading bread dough and soothing a fretful baby and writing neat columns of numbers in the ranch ledgers. Every evening, even years after they were healed, Charles still took her hands in his and rubbed in the salve, simply because it was their ritual, their moment of connection at the end of each busy day. When Samuel was 3 years old, Katherine became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and in the spring of 1877, she gave birth to a daughter they named Clara Rose. The little girl had her mother's dark hair and her father's steady temperament, and Samuel took to his role as big brother with surprising seriousness for a 3-year-old. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The children grew, the ranch flourished, and Charles and Katherine's love deepened with each passing year. They had their challenges, of course. There were droughts that tested their resources, cattle illnesses that required sleepless nights, and the constant demands of raising children and running a business. But they faced everything together, partners in the truest sense of the word. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Charles surprised Katherine with a trip back to San Francisco, leaving the children with Thomas and his wife, who had moved to the ranch to help with the growing household. They stayed in a nice hotel, ate dinner at an expensive restaurant, and walked along the waterfront where Katherine had first arrived all those years ago. "You ever regret it?" Charles asked as they stood watching the ships in the harbor, their hands linked together. "Leaving Boston, coming here, marrying a stranger." Katherine turned to face him, studying the face she knew better than her own now, the lines that had deepened around his eyes, the gray that was starting to show in his sandy hair. He was 42 years old, she was 33, and they had built a life together that exceeded anything she had dared to dream about when she was a miserable young woman scrubbing floors in a boarding house. "I regret nothing," she said firmly. "Every hard thing I went through led me to you, to this life, to our children. How could I regret that?" I was so nervous that day at the stagecoach, Charles admitted. When I saw you step down, looking so exhausted and determined, I thought you would take one look at the ranch and demand to be taken back to the city. And then you took off your glove, and I saw your hands. And you did not recoil, Katherine finished. You saw the damage and immediately looked for a way to help. That was when I knew you were different, Charles. That was when I started to hope this might become more than just a practical arrangement. Those hands, Charles said, lifting her right hand to his lips and kissing it gently, told me everything I needed to know about you. They told me you were a fighter, a survivor, someone who did what needed to be done no matter the cost. I saw your hands and I saw your character, and I knew I wanted to spend my life with you. They kissed there on the waterfront, two people who had started as strangers brought together by necessity, who had become friends through shared work, who had fallen in love through small acts of kindness, and who had built something lasting and true. The years continued to pass. Samuel grew into a tall, serious young man who loved ranching as much as his father did, and Clara became a bright, curious girl who wanted to know everything about everything. When Samuel was 15, they sent him to a good school in San Francisco during the school year, though he came home every weekend to help with the ranch work. Clara followed a few years later, though she had ambitions beyond ranching, talking about becoming a teacher or perhaps even a doctor like Dr. Shaw. Charles and Katherine grew older together gracefully, their bodies wearing the marks of hard work and full lives, but their love remained as strong as ever. The evening ritual never changed. No matter how tired they were, no matter what challenges the day had brought, Charles would take Katherine's hands in his and work the salve into her skin while they talked about their day, their children, their dreams for the future. When Katherine turned 55, she and Charles decided it was time to start stepping back from the daily operations of the ranch. Samuel, now 25 and newly married to a wonderful young woman named Elizabeth, was more than ready to take over, and they had several reliable hands who could manage the work. Charles and Katherine moved into a smaller house they built on the property, closer to the creek, with a wide porch where they could sit and watch the sunsets. One evening, as they rocked on that porch, Katherine looked at her hands in the fading light. They were old hands now, spotted with age and crossed with veins, but they were healthy and pain-free, capable and strong. The scars from the lye soap were still visible if you looked closely, faint white lines across her palms and knuckles, but they no longer defined her. "What are you thinking about?" Charles asked, reaching over to take one of her hands in his, a gesture so familiar and natural that neither of them even noticed doing it anymore. "I am thinking about the day I arrived here," Katherine said. "How frightened I was, how uncertain. How my hands hurt so much that I could barely hold onto my bag, and I am thinking about how you saw that pain and decided to do something about it." "It was just salve," Charles said modestly, but Katherine shook her head. "It was not just salve. It was kindness. It was respect. It was you seeing me as a person worth caring for, worth helping. You could have ignored my pain or told me to toughen up or been disgusted by how rough they were. Instead, you treated them, every single evening until they healed. And in doing that, you healed more than just my hands, Charles. You healed something inside me that I did not even know was broken." Charles brought her hand to his lips, kissing it softly. "You healed me too. I was so lonely before you came, even though I did not realize it. I thought all I needed was the ranch, the work, the land. But you showed me what it means to have a partner, to share your life with someone who understands you. You made this house a home, Katherine. You made me whole." They sat together as the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. From the main house, they could hear laughter as Samuel and Elizabeth put their own children to bed. The next generation of Andersons who would grow up on this land, learning the value of hard work and kindness and treating each other with respect. Katherine thought about the girl she had been, the one who had scrubbed floors until her hands bled, who had answered a matrimonial advertisement out of desperation, who had traveled across a continent to marry a stranger. That girl could never have imagined this life, this love, this profound sense of belonging and contentment. "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing Charles's hand. "For what? For seeing me. For choosing me. For loving me." Charles smiled, that rare, full smile that still made her heart skip a beat even after more than 30 years of marriage. "Thank you for answering my advertisement. Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely rancher with a run-down ranch and a tin of salve. Thank you for building this life with me." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they remained on the porch, hands linked. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and created something beautiful. The ranch would continue, passed down through generations. But the true legacy of Charles and Katherine Anderson was not in the land or the cattle or the buildings. It was in the love they had cultivated, as carefully and patiently as Charles had cultivated the healing of Katherine's damaged hands, tending to it every day with small acts of kindness and devotion, until it grew into something stronger than either of them could have created alone. The tin of salve, worn and dented now, still sat on their bedside table, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. And every evening, without fail, Charles would open it and take Katherine's hands in his, working the ointment into her skin while they talked and laughed and simply enjoyed each other's presence. It was a ritual born of necessity that had become an expression of love, a physical manifestation of their commitment to care for each other, to heal each other's wounds, to face whatever challenges life brought them together. Years later, when they were both gone and their great-grandchildren sorted through their belongings, they would find that tin of salve, still half full, and wonder at its significance. But Samuel's children, who had heard the story many times, would explain how their great-grandfather had rubbed salve into their great-grandmother's damaged hands every evening, how that simple act had been the foundation of a love story that had lasted more than 50 years. They would explain how Katherine Anderson had arrived in California with nothing but a carpet bag and hands ruined by lye soap, and how Charles Anderson had seen past the surface to the strong, capable, loving woman beneath. They would talk about the ranch that had been built on hard work and mutual respect, about the family that had grown from two strangers who dared to take a chance on each other. And they would hold that battered tin of salve carefully, reverently, understanding that it represented something more precious than gold or land or any material wealth. It represented the kind of love that notices another person's pain and seeks to ease it, the kind of love that shows up every day with quiet consistency, the kind of love that transforms two separate, lonely lives into one shared journey of joy and purpose. Katherine Ellis had boarded a stagecoach in Boston with rough, damaged hands and a heart that had forgotten how to hope. She had stepped down in San Francisco to meet a stranger who would become her husband, her partner, her best friend, and the love of her life. And through the simple, daily act of tending to her wounds, Charles Anderson had shown her what it meant to be truly seen, truly valued, truly loved. Their story was not one of grand gestures or dramatic declarations, though there had been moments of both. It was a story of everyday kindness, of patience and persistence, of two people who chose each other over and over again through all the seasons of their lives. It was a story that proved love was not just a feeling but an action, Not just words, but consistent, caring behavior that healed old wounds and prevented new ones. In the end, as Katherine lay in bed at the age of 73, with Charles holding her hand and their children and grandchildren gathered around, she looked at her husband and smiled. Her hands, still clasped in his, were old and weathered but whole, a testament to the healing power of love and care. She had lived a full life, a happy life, a life beyond anything she could have imagined that day she arrived in San Francisco as a desperate mail-order bride. "I love you," she whispered to Charles, and he leaned close to hear her. "I love you too," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Always have, always will." Katherine closed her eyes, content. She had found her home, her purpose, her place in the world. And it had all started with a man who noticed her pain and decided to do something about it, one evening at a time, with patience and care and a tin of healing salve. She passed peacefully that night, surrounded by love, her hands warm in Charles's grasp. He would follow her 3 years later, and when he died, their children made sure he was buried holding the old tin of salve, so that even in death, he could continue the ritual that had defined their love and their life together. The ranch continued through the generations, prospering and growing, but those who lived there never forgot the story of how it all began. They never forgot Charles and Katherine, the mail-order bride with damaged hands and the cowboy who healed them, who had shown everyone who came after that true love was not about grand gestures but about showing up, day after day, ready to tend to each other's wounds and share in each other's joys. It was a love story worthy of the West, built on hard work and honest communication, tested by the challenges of frontier life, and strengthened by mutual respect and genuine affection. It was a love that had transformed two lonely people into a family, two separate dreams into one shared reality, two damaged hearts into one unbreakable bond. And it all started with rough hands, lye soap damage, and a cowboy who noticed, who cared, and who decided that every evening without fail he would apply salve and show this brave woman who had traveled so far that she was worth caring for, worth healing, worth loving with everything he had. That was the legacy of Charles and Katherine Anderson, a legacy of kindness that echoed through the years, reminding every generation that came after them of the transformative power of simple, consistent, everyday love.